Alrighty, buddy. This is take two. For thanks to Janet for let me know that the recording the video had no sound. So this is take two of writing a method section. Um, don't know what happened to the first one, but I'll probably be more concise on this one anyway. So in this presentation, I'm going to review what goes into a method section. So the next assignment you have coming up is the lit review. So hopefully you're working on that one and you watch the presentation on writing a lit review. Just like the lit review, the method section is something you need to do from an outline. So the method section assignment is laid out just like this PowerPoint. It has the same headings, and these are very typical headings that you'll see in articles that use single case research. That's one reason I was so insistent that you find articles related to single case research, is those articles provide excellent models for you as you complete your lit review and method section assignment, and they're going to be very helpful to you when you do the final project, which is going to include those other parts that you've been working on. So think in terms of an outline. Use the major headings on the assignment and in this presentation for your outline, and then you're going to be filling in information under those headings. So I usually will go through several drafts of outlines, adding more and more information before I ever get to the point that I try putting something in narrative form. By the time I start writing, I have absolutely all the information I need right in front of me. And all I have to do is translate it into a narrative that someone can read and understand. So do your work up front, and it makes this process a lot easier. So what is the purpose of a method section in general? Well, the method section for a research report provides the reader, and if it's someone who is trained in that area, that individual should be able to replicate that study the way it was implemented. So that's the purpose of a method section. It's essentially a task analysis for how to replicate the study. Um, for a research proposal, which is what you're going to be doing, it's pretty much the same thing, except you're writing in future tense rather than reporting on research that's already been conducted. You are writing for a proposed study, so the tense is a little different. Research proposals usually include more detail actually than research reports because they're very explicit in explaining what actually needs to take place. So be very mindful of the level of detail you need to include in the description of your study. It should be a cookbook or a task analysis on how to actually do it. So there's two questions that a method section answers. The first one is, how were the data collected or generated? So a research report is reporting data, so where did those data come from? You have to know where the data come from to be able to interpret them and to know how you're going to apply them to other settings and other situations, and to understand what are the implications of these data. What do they really mean? The method section also explains how the data were analyzed. So how are they summarized and why? So you're showing the reader how you got your results. The method section is where you provide reasons for the choices you made. So choices such as the type of research design. Why did you use this type? Why did you select this particular design? And how does this design relate back to your research question? Why did you choose the measurements that you chose? How did these measurements relate back to your research question? Everything should relate back to your research question and how your study addresses the question or questions. So as we said before, a method section has to describe how the data were collected and analyzed because that affects the way the results are interpreted, and it certainly affects the implications of the results. It also helps the reader understand the validity and reliability of the results. And we've talked about validity and reliability before. Validity is, well, there are two forms of validity in research. There's internal validity and external validity. Internal validity has to do with the extent to which um, changes in the dependent variable are related to the independent variable and to nothing else. And how well your research methodology does that is a reflection of the internal validity. External validity is the extent to which your research findings apply to other situations and settings and individuals. So they're somewhat different. It's possible for a study to have very, very high internal validity and very low external validity. We'll talk about that a little more later. Reliability is the extent to which two independent observers would record the same thing. So it's an assessment of the quality of the recording system and method. So a good description in a method section helps the reader interpret how valid and reliable the results are, and that helps them determine what kinds of conclusions can be drawn from the data. And as we said before, this is where you make it clear why you chose the particular methods you chose, down to data collection, even to the way you implement the independent variable. Why did you do it in this particular way? If there's something that isn't readily apparent to a reader, you should explain it in the methods section. So the format that we're going to describe here is the one that is described in the publication manual of the American Psychological Association. So these are APA method section headings. So these should be the main headings of your outline: the participants, the setting, the personnel, apparatus and materials, independent and dependent variables, procedures, experimental design, reliability of measurement, procedural fidelity, and social validity. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. So the participants section should include all the information that's relevant for your particular study. And different pieces of information are going to be more relevant depending on the nature of the study. For example, if you were doing a study related to methods for teaching social skills to young children with autism, your participant description would need to include a very detailed description of that participant or the participant's levels of social skills. If you were doing an academic intervention, your participant information would need to include very detailed information of the academic level of those participants. Or communication, it certainly would describe the communication skills. So while you have demographic information, which are some of the things listed here, focus on other things that might be relevant for your particular study, and it's going to vary from study to study. I know that a recent study that Erica Pinter and I submitted for publication had transitioning students using the gymnasium, and one of the reviewers asked us to add information about those participants, each one's experience with fitness training. You know, what was their exposure to going to the gym outside of school? You know, what things had they learned to do? And that was certainly relevant, and I guess we didn't include it in enough detail. So all the things you see here, plus other things that might be relevant. Ethical provisions in research focus on the extent to which you protect the rights of your participants. And so, for example, describe how you obtain consent, or how you will contain consent. How are you going to protect confidentiality of the individuals? It becomes particularly important when we're dealing with protected populations, and most of the time we're working with children with disabilities or adults with disabilities, and we have to explain how we're going to protect those individuals' rights. How we're going to make it clear and communicate to those individuals that they have a right not to participate in the research if they choose. that becomes a little complicated sometimes, and you certainly do run into ethical issues. I've had situations where I've been in a school setting and the parents are like, yes, I want my son to participate in this study. And then I work with the kid maybe twice, and the kid says, I don't want to do this. And I try to say, oh, well, it's going to be a lot of fun, and, your mom and dad really want you to do it. And I probably go a little further than I should. But then if it's clear that this person, no, I just don't want to do this, okay, you're done. I've had parents get really angry with me, I wanted him to participate in this. Well, he chose not to, and I have to respect his rights. And they looked at me like I was nuts, but you do have to respect the rights of the participants, and participation in research is voluntary. So if you're doing a study, it's different from the prescribed treatment plan of an individual. And it gets more complicated because when I've worked in sites as a clinician, when I wasn't a university faculty, I was involved in research, and I was responsible for behavioral treatment of individuals and also doing research. And I had to wear two different hats, and I had to treat things a little bit differently. Um, Research should always be something that's a choice of the individual. Setting. Just like the information under participants, what you include under setting is going to vary depending on the study. So of course the information you see here is always relevant, but sometimes because of the nature of your study, other aspects are going to be relevant. For example, um, doing back in maybe 15 years ago, I was involved in a series of research studies on embedded instruction. I may have mentioned that before. And because of the way the grant was written, they were only interested in our implementation of strategies in general education settings while regular general education instruction was going on. So, for example, if the class was teaching a lesson and I took a kid to the back of the room to work on building a skill, that was unacceptable for that study. It doesn't mean that that's a bad thing to do or that it's not something that should happen with that kid, but as far as data for that particular study, that kid had to be included with the general education students, like sitting amongst them while everything else was going on. So, in writing those studies up, we went to great lengths to explain that, to explain how this was done in the context of regularly scheduled instruction and not outside of that. So, think about replication when you're describing the setting and what would be important for someone else who was going to repeat that, who's going to repeat the study. Other personnel. So in this setting, you're describing individuals other than the researchers, although you certainly describe the experimenters or researchers and their level of training, but other teachers, assistants, anyone involved in the study. There's demographic information, things like their age, their sex, level of training, but then if they have particular skills relevant to that study, describe those, or if they've been exposed to a certain kind of training. For example, if you're doing a research study that is related to staff training, and I know several of you are, this would be it'd be important under either participants or other personnel to explain those individuals' previous training or their level of skills going into the study in this particular area. Apparatus and materials. So here you're certainly, if you have equipment, if you're using computers or mobile devices or other kinds of materials. So with the fitness study, we of course described the iPods we were using, but we also described the equipment in the gym that the individuals were using and the other things in that facility they had access to. Um, if you're doing something unique to your study, like sometimes you might build something or place something in a way relevant to your study that's not the way it's typically used, you have to be very careful describing those situations and providing enough detail. Sometimes you have to even include illustrations or measurements if it's something out of the ordinary. Um, I know some of the studies I've done, if it was a setup for an instruction and I believed that the way I arranged the environment was very relevant to someone replicating it, I would do a diagram of where the children, where the students were seated, where the teacher was seated, and where the observers were. Typically, I wouldn't do that, but in a couple of cases, it's been really relevant. If this is also if you're using some kind of testing instrument or some kind of scale or rating scale that is commercially available, this is where you would describe the reliability or validity, the published reliability or validity of that instrument. Task selection. Here you're talking about well, this is more relevant in a study that is assessing some kind of instructional method, or if you're assessing the effects of some kind of behavioral intervention on a student's ability to attend and engage in a task. This would be very relevant as well. Um, it's particularly important in studies in a couple of situations. One of them is multiple baseline across instructional tasks. So let's say you have 3 tasks, you're applying an intervention sequentially across each one, and you want to assess the effectiveness of this intervention. So in this case, it would be one intervention that you're sequentially. So I use this for some of the embedded instruction studies, and I would have things, the kids would be in different classes included. So an example was one kid was in a science class, and we embedded instructional content across different subject areas. So we took baseline data on insects and spiders, botany, and human anatomy. And there was a set of concepts under each one. So let's say there were 10 concepts that the student was learning. So we tested each unit. So there was, think of them as instructional units. Tested his knowledge on all 3 units, and then instruction started on unit 1, and we continued to take data on unit 1 and take baseline on units 2 and 3, and then eventually instruction started on unit 2, and then finally on unit 3. Well, what you need for that to work really well is the level of difficulty across those 3 tasks need to be about the same. So typically what's done is you'll develop some instructional materials and you'll present those to some individuals that teach those subjects. Like we had science teachers, I think I had 5 different middle school science teachers rate the difficulty level of different content, and I matched it up so that overall each unit was about the same level of difficulty. The other situation where it's really important is if you're doing an alternating treatments design and you're comparing 2 different instructional methods. You want to be absolutely sure that the in what is being taught with one method is of equal difficulty to what's being taught with the second method. Because if there's a difference between the student's performance in the 2 conditions, you want it to be related to the instructional method and not because one set of materials was more difficult than the other. So you need to have some data as well where experts have evaluated the difficulty level. So in your methods section, you need to explain how you selected the instructional tasks and what links did you go to ensure that the level of difficulty was equal. Also, this is where you would talk about how you would control for things like time of day. So you would describe how you would do counterbalancing between morning and afternoon if that was relevant to your study. Experimental design. So this is where you come out and just say what your experimental design is. I think you noticed that in some of the studies, the researchers just came out and said, we use an alternating treatment design. Sometimes they don't. I don't like it. I think researchers should always just come out and say, this is the experimental design we used. So I want you to just say, this study will involve blank design. Then you give a rationale. Why are you using this design? There's got to be a reason, not because I thought I know how to make the graph for this one, but why are you doing this particular research design? Why is it the one you selected? And the reason should be pretty clear. I'm doing a comparison of two independent variables. This design allows that to happen. Or let's say that you're doing a multiple baseline design, and the purpose of the study is to demonstrate the effectiveness of blank instructional method. An ABAB design would not be appropriate because once the students have learned the skill, withdrawing the instructional intervention isn't going to make them magically forget it. So you'd say it a little better than that, but that's why a multiple baseline would be appropriate, or because of the nature of this behavior, it's not appropriate to withdraw the intervention. So that would be acceptable. So the big reason is this design fits with my research question because of this reason, and it's appropriate for the participants because of this reason. Also, this is where you describe how are you going to use it within the context of your study. So with a multiple baseline, it would be, I'm going to sequentially implement this intervention across either 3 participants, 3 behaviors, 3 settings, whatever. In the course of alternating treatments design, you describe how you're going to alternate the independent variable, whatever it is, on alternate days or alternate sessions, whatever you're going to do. So this section presents the research design, describes the design, gives some reference. If you reference your textbook, that's fine. Reference the chapter where you read about the design, give you the rationale as to why you selected it, and explain how it's going to work in your study. Recording procedure. So this is the fun part. So you by now should have an idea of the dependent variable or dependent variables that you are going to use. The next thing you need to determine is what method of recording makes the most sense. Now go back to your research question. What method of recording is going to give you the information you need to answer your research question? So it's going to depend. Do you need to have a duration or an estimate of duration or prevalence, like duration or momentary time sampling? Will frequency recording, sometimes that's the best method. And sometimes with frequency you need to be aware that you need to report it as rate because the observation times may not be equal. Sometimes latency is the measure that makes the most sense. Sometimes it's percentage of opportunities. So if you have a behavior that can only occur under a certain situation, and the number of those situations is going to be different from day to day, be sure that you report your data in percentage occurrences, or percentage occurred, percentage of intervals, percentage of opportunities, whatever. Now here you're explaining how the data are going to be collected. So what observation tool are you going to use? And also, how are you going to assess inter-observer agreement? What formula are you going to use for inter-observer agreement? Now, the formula that's used depends on the type of measurement you're doing. There's a number of reasons, and the other video presentation for this week reviews calculating IOA. How are you going to train your observers? And what is going to be your criteria of inter-observer agreement in order to begin data collection? So those are all the things you have to consider. So you should be getting the ideas. A lot of details go into each of these sections. So that's why it's so important to work from an outline. And you're going to need to reread it several times and keep adding details. Independent variable. So this is where you clearly define and describe your intervention, your independent variable. If you're implementing some kind of treatment package, you need to go into enough detail and explain each component of the package. Some of you may be implementing something that is based on some kind of published manual. In those instances, you need to summarize the information and reference the manual. You don't copy the manual, but certainly describe the components in enough detail that someone can understand, and then the person again may have to actually go to the manual. But whether your intervention is some kind of behavioral intervention or academic strategy, you need to give a very thorough description of what it actually is and what it involves. Dependent variables. So your dependent variable is the stuff that you're collecting data on. This is what you're measuring. So list each dependent variable and give an overview of how you're going to collect data and how you're going to report those data. It's typically the tradition to do a subheading for each measure. So as you in this section, your main heading would be dependent variables, and then your subsections would be each measure and how those data are going to be collected. Definition and measurement of behavior. And there's a lot of overlap with this stuff, I know. The dependent variable section is going to list each target behavior or each area. Here you get more specific about measurement techniques and what constitutes a response. So don't be afraid if there's a little bit of redundancy. What I would suggest is don't stress at this point over, well, I've already talked to this under dependent variables, so if I mention it again under measurement of behavior, is that a bad thing? That's okay at this point. We can streamline it later. I wouldn't worry about that. Be more concerned about just getting all the information down. What you want to be sure of at this point, though, is be sure that you've got all of your operational definitions and your criteria for how they're going to be recorded. Procedures. This is my favorite part. So your procedures are essentially this is the real task analysis. So you've already talked about your independent variables, your dependent variables. You've talked about your measurement systems, how you've defined all the behaviors, how you train the observers. This section, okay, now that you know what I'm doing, this is the blueprint for actually doing the study. So you do a description of when and how you implement the independent variables, when and how you collect data on the dependent variables in the context of the research design you've selected. Sometimes in this section, if it gets a little complicated, do a summary table. What I usually do is I just start out and do a summary table to begin with because it helps me write the section. So I'm going to suggest the same thing for you. Do a table, a summary table of your procedures. Just list them out and then write a narrative that explains the table. That's the easiest way to do it. So the other way to think about this, suppose that you were going to do your study, and just before you were going to start, you got sick. And I mean, this is terrible. I don't want you to get sick, but let's say that happened, or you got something contagious. You got this actually happened to me a couple of years ago. I got shingles at the end of the semester, and I had a couple of students who were pregnant because I went to my doctor, and she said, well, you're fine as long as you just stay away from pregnant women. I was like, well, I have 2 students who were about to have babies. She said, well, you need to stay away from them. So I had to let my students who were pregnant attend class remotely because they couldn't be around me. So let's say you got the no, I don't want anybody to get sick. Hypothetically, you cannot be there. So you write out a very detailed set of instructions to two very good friends who are going to do your study for you. That's your procedure section. You're okay, so for the next 2 weeks this is what you're going to do, and it's laid out very clearly. Now you have some excellent models because you have some published studies. Look at the studies that you included in your lit review that use single case research designs. Look at the procedure sections. That's what you're going to do for your study. Session information. This section's pretty short, so it relates to the when you actually implemented your dependent variable and collected data. Did it occur over the course of a day? Did it occur within experimental sessions? Describe that. How long were the sessions? Or just explain that this occurred throughout the school day, or this was between the hours of 10 and 12. Also, if your study had multiple phases, how long were the phases? Or in the case of a proposal that you're writing, what's going to be your criteria from going from one phase to another? Are there any other types of instructions that you would give to the participants? For example, we're going to use these machines to learn how to exercise. I want you to watch the video, and then I want you to do what the person in the video does. I mean, it could be something really simple, but were there any special instructions to give your participants? Data collection and instrumentation. We talk a lot about data collection. Gosh, at this point, it's a summary of how the data were collected for each dependent variable. If you're going to use any software to analyze your data, like SPSS or other kind of statistical software, in single case research, typically we don't. But sometimes I'll use SPSS to summarize demographic data. If you're using assessment tools that are published, for example, let's say you're using a social skills rating scale or some other type of instrument, you would provide information on those scales. Sometimes a sample data sheet is helpful. I do want you to include a data sheet. I want you to see that you've thought this through enough that you've actually created a data sheet. So in this section, include your data sheet with instructions on how it was used. So overall, make sure that you've got enough information that someone could replicate your study, or in the case of a proposal, I should be able to take your method section, I should be able to implement your study, or I should be able to give it to someone else and say, hey, go do this. And they should be able to implement your study the way you intended it to be implemented. Be clear about what you're going to do. I mean, that's the essence of it. I realize there's a lot of redundancy, especially with the data collection stuff. So put your information where you think it makes the most sense. Don't be afraid if you've got some redundancy at this point, in other words, and we can sort that out later. But the main thing is to get your information down and put it in a form that's understandable. You've got a lot to think about with this assignment. So what I suggest is, you've got some time before the lit review assignment's done. Sort of think about, you've got the lit review and method section assignment almost as one big assignment that's due in two successive parts, because you have to start thinking about this even as you're doing the lit review. Just to put things in perspective, in a research article, we typically have these parts. It starts out with an introduction of the research problem, some objectives of the study, and how those objectives are going to be met. Then there's a review of the literature. That's what you're going to be turning in pretty soon. That talks about previous research, and it builds up to a justification for the current study and why it's going to be taking place. So that's what you're working on, is this is what's known, this is what people have been doing. Here's the reason for my study. Then you have the methods section. The methods section explains how the research is going to be conducted, how the data are going to be collected, how the data are going to be analyzed. In other words, this is what I'm going to do. Then there's the results section. You're not going to have results because you're not going to have any data, although I hope some of you actually go and implement your study. What you will have, though, is what we'll talk about it later. I do want you to explain after the method section assignment. We'll talk about how once you gather data, how are you going to present it, and how would it what would be the most meaningful way to convey your data and interpret it. But in a study, the results section, single case studies results sections are typically short. The graphs are included in the results section, and we usually just have enough narrative to go along with the graphs to help someone interpret them. We don't really present a whole bunch of numbers typically unless there's some reason. With results sections also, if all the participants had similar patterns, we typically will report them all together. Something to the effect of all participants showed an immediate change in level when the independent variables implemented, blah, blah, blah. If the participants were different in the way they responded to the intervention, then you'll see the results reported participant by participant. And then finally, the discussion section is really the fun part. So you've told everybody what you did, you've reported the results kind of in a straightforward kind of way, like, okay, here's the data. Now you get to talk about, okay, this is what the data meant. This is how I interpret these results. And I think these are the implications for these results. This is also when you talk about limitations of your study. Now, limitations or talking about limitations of your own study is not a weakness. It actually shows that you're objective. Every study that's ever been conducted has limitations because studies are focused on very specific things. So by the nature of, I'm taking a really hard look at this one specific thing, well, automatically, you're not looking at other stuff that might also be important. So that's a limitation, and that's one we accept. So what are the limitations, and what would impact the extent to which someone could apply your research to other settings and situations? And you always want to point those things out yourself rather than have other people read your article and point it out for you. So the discussion section also culminates with some discussion about the next step in research. So as a researcher, when you write up a report, one of the cool things you get to do is you get to make suggestions for where research should go in the future. And very often researchers are guided by published article recommendations for further research. So you get to contribute in a cool way to the field and the directions in which things might go. And of course, for the recording procedures, look at that other presentation we did. There was one for last week, and then there's another one this week. Don't get into this too much because it's covered in the other one, but be sure that you're paying attention to the method of data collection that makes the most sense for your study. So if you have occurrence or event-based behaviors, then you're going to be reporting either frequency or rate or percentage of opportunities or percentage correct. Or is an interval type method or an estimating procedure more relevant? So remember, there's partial interval, whole interval, and momentary time sampling. Each one of them has its own use. And then, of course, the other area is time, which would be latency or duration. Now, momentary time sampling gives you a good estimate of duration, whereas partial interval and whole interval is related more to frequency, and it gives you a measure of the prevalence of a behavior. Partial interval recording is used sort of an estimate of frequency or prevalence. Whole interval recording is when you're more concerned about sustained behaviors that are occurring over a long period of time. So um, most of the time I use either partial interval or momentary time sampling, unless I'm doing something I'm recording percentage correct or rate of a behavior. In other situation, many of you may be teaching a behavioral chain, and then you're doing task analysis recording. Then you're going to be reporting the percentage of steps independently, or reporting the level of assistance at each step. So there's more review of this in the other presentation. And this was a flowchart that Tony Van Laarhoven and I did many years ago. We were actually doctoral students, so we were asked to come up with this. So when do you use rate? When do you use percentage? So the question is, are there trials or opportunities, or is the behavior, is it occurring when there are opportunities involved? And if yes, then are the opportunities consistent across sessions? And if they are, you can actually use frequency, because even though it's based on opportunities, the opportunities are consistent. So the point here is you can compare session to session because the opportunities are consistent. If the opportunities are not consistent, then you have to use percentage, because if answering questions, he answered questions 50% of the time. All right, well, let's say that the student answered 4 questions today, and then the next day he answered 8 questions. Well, the first day there may have only been 4 questions. The next day there could have been 50 questions and he answered 8. So you certainly can't assume that the performance was higher. So reporting in percentages allows you to compare across data points when opportunities are inconsistent. If there are no opportunities, then is the length of the observation constant? If the length of the observation is constant, then you can use frequency. If the length of the observation is not constant, let's say you observe for an hour one day and 2 hours the next day, you can't use frequency because you had a longer period of observing. So how can you keep all those data points? You convert it to rate. So rate is the frequency divided by the unit of time. So for some reason, rate confuses people. It drives people crazy, and it's usually on test questions related to measurement, people always miss the rate questions. I think it's just because people talk themselves into it being difficult. It's not. You're used to rate. I mean, think of miles per hour. It's a unit, the occurrence of something per unit of time. So 4 times per minute, 12 times per day. That's rate. So typically in behavioral terminology, we use rate per minute. Don't be weirded out if it's decimal, like a rate of 0.5 times per minute just means it happens once every 2 minutes. So it's not that abstract, and it's frequent. Often, I mean, if something happens less than 60 times an hour, it's going to be less than 1 per minute. So it's common to have a rate that is a decimal. So hopefully this clarifies that a little bit. If it doesn't, just look at it and review it some more. But you can always be safe by always using percentage and always using rate, but there are times when it's clearer to just use frequency, and you can under certain circumstances. So be sure, if you haven't done so, read the chapter in the book that talks about, I believe it's chapter 3, talks about the lit review, and it also talks about what goes into the method section. So that's a good complement to this presentation. So if you haven't read that, go read it right now. Certainly read it before you attempt to work on your method section assignment. If you have any questions, just let me know, and I'll be talking to you on June 26th.